Welcome to the Suspension Report Card, a detailed presentation designed to help you understand three key aspects of Giant's proprietary bicycle suspension system. First, you'll learn about the fundamentals of mountain bike suspension technology and be introduced to two of the most important components, those being control and comfort. Next, you'll learn about the inside secrets of Giant's Maestro suspension system, including how and why it works so well. Finally, you'll learn exactly how Maestro stacks up against its key competitors in a comprehensive, head-to-head report card style comparison. Before we unveil the report card results, it's important to first understand why we need suspension at all. The answer is two key reasons, those being control and comfort. Let's take a look at each. The single most important reason to utilize suspension is to keep the tires of a vehicle in contact with the ground. If the contact patch of a tire is breached, even for a split second, control of the vehicle is lost, potentially with disastrous results. Try to navigate your hardtail into a sweeping corner littered with stutter bumps, and it shouldn't come as any surprise that the rear end of your bike slips and sways over the terrain, hopefully not pitching you into the rough. A mountain bike equipped with full suspension technology remains in complete contact with the ground, no matter how rough it might be. Simply put, full suspension equals control. Let's look at the second benefit of full suspension, which is comfort. While not as critical as control, comfort is a key benefit of suspension technology. Non-suspended riders are forced to endure every bump and thump transferred from the ground to their hands, butt, and feet. Because of this, non-suspended riders are literally fighting against their bike and the terrain, a fact that eventually takes its toll on the rider's performance. As a result, suspended riders can ride longer and stronger than non-suspended riders. So now you've learned about the two most important characteristics behind full suspension, those being control and comfort. Now let's shift gears a little bit and get technical. You're about to learn the inside secrets behind Maestro's suspension technology. This is the secret. 4, 2, 1. 4 pivot points allow 2 rocker arms to articulate in a manner that creates a single floating pivot point. Maestro utilizes 4 strategically positioned pivot points that create a single floating pivot point. This pivot point ensures pedaling efficiency by counteracting pedaling forces that would otherwise create suspension compression, or what's known as pedal bob. At the same time, Maestro allows for a full range of suspension activity even under harsh braking, so there's no loss in braking power or traction. The more active the suspension, the better the traction, the better your ability to get power to the ground. So we've come to the highlight of this presentation. It's what Giant calls the suspension report card. What is it? It's a simple hands-on way of evaluating bicycle full suspension technology. Anytime one of Giant's product managers, engineers, or athletes throws a leg over a bicycle, even if it's not one of ours, they ask themselves these 3 fundamental questions. Is the suspension fully active? Is it independent? And is it completely efficient? In asking these 3 questions, Giant is able to evaluate any full suspension bike technology out there on the market. In the end, it helps Giant build a better bicycle. Let's take a closer look at each of these 3 components so that we fully understand the fundamentals of the suspension report card. Believe it or not, there are generally 2 kinds of bumps out there on the trail. The first is a stutter bump. This is found in groups of multiple rapid succession hits. The second is a G-out, or singular big hit. A critical capability of suspension performance is how effectively the suspension can absorb both the stutter-type hits and G-outs. Some designs are effective at one or the other, but few remain active to both. A full range of suspension activity allows your bike to track over and remain in contact with all types of rough terrain. Giant tests for activity in the following manner. A rigid dummy fork is installed in the frame. The fork is fixed at the dropouts. A reinforced dummy hub is installed at the rear dropout. The frame is weighted to simulate a 140-pound rider, and the rear shock is charged to achieve a 20% sag. Any adjustable compression damping is either turned off or set to its lowest setting. The rear of the bike is precisely elevated to 3 different heights, 30 millimeters simulating small hits, 70 millimeters simulating a moderate hit, and up to 160 millimeters simulating a big hit. The rear of the bike is released and the frame is allowed to fall onto an immovable block, having the dummy hub take the impact. A linear positional gauge positioned on the shock measures shock movement as a result of the hit. The ratio of total shock travel divided by the amount of shock movement for a particular size hit is then calculated. Ideally, a superior suspension design is sensitive to small hits, but won't bottom out under bigger hits. Giant's activity test uncovers the truth. Efficiency. An efficient suspension design is paramount to making sure every watt of power you're able to generate gets cleanly transferred to the rear wheel. If the suspension motion fights against your pedal stroke by pulling back on the chain, the design is inefficient. Likewise, if your pedal stroke causes the suspension to compress or extend, the suspension design is working against you, not for you. Efficiency is the hardest variable to perfect in bicycle suspension design. And while no suspension design is 100% efficient, some do come close. Make sure to pay close attention to pedal feedback on your next test ride to determine your bike's efficiency. Giant tests for efficiency in the following manner. Using data acquisition on a ride-ready bicycle, Giant engineers set up a linear positional gauge on the frame's rear shock. Load cells are added to the bicycle's pedals to monitor the test rider's power wattage. A recording-capable speedometer is mounted to the handlebars. The bike's suspension is again set up to support a 140-pound rider with 20% sag. And again, any sort of compression damping is turned off or fully minimized. Each bike is then ridden up a 12% grade in each of its 3 chainring positions, while the rear gear selection is left to the 18-tooth cog. As the bike is pedaled uphill, the linear positional gauge measures the amount of shock movement under constant wattage pedaling force. More shock movement under pedaling equals decreased efficiency. Independence. We're talking about braking independence here. This variable asks how the suspension performs under braking input. Many suspension designs lock out under braking forces, usually when you're headed downhill or into a rough section of trail, precisely the time when you need full suspension activity. Next time you're testing a bike, slam on the rear brakes and ask yourself if the rear suspension remains fully active and, likewise, doesn't compress or extend, causing unexpected geometry variations. Giant tests for independence in the following manner. Again, using the same data acquisition-equipped complete bicycles, Giant engineers test independence by coasting up to a speed of 15 miles an hour down the 12% grade under a weight of a 140-pound rider. Again, the shock is set up for the weight of a 140-pound rider with 20% sag and minimal compression damping. The rear brake only is applied to slow the bike to a complete stop as quickly as possible without skidding. The same linear positional gauge measures the amount of shock compression that occurs under this heavy braking. More shock compression under braking equals poorer performance. Now it's time for the head-to-head comparison portion of the suspension report card. The suspension designs tested in the suspension report card are single pivot, VPP, 4-bar, R1I, Maestro. Let's begin with a look at VPP design as found on the Santa Cruz Blur LT. Activity. Just a B-. Activity is reasonable. Efficiency. A solid A+ here. It does pedal extremely well. Independence. Achieves only a C grade here because VPP designs sacrifice braking independence for efficiency. 4-bar linkage, as found on the specialized stump jumper FSR. Activity. It gets an A-. From stutters to big hits, 4-bar excels in bump compliance. Efficiency. It gets only a D. With its near vertical wheel path, FSR bobs under pedaling motion and relies heavily upon its brain shock to compensate for its inefficiency. Independence, a poor C- grade. This type of suspension is acceptable, but not great at separating braking forces from suspension activity. Single pivot, as found on Cannondale's Rush. Activity, it gets a C-. Absolutely reliant on shock technology, single pivot designs are characteristically one-dimensional, meaning they can be tuned to function well in one characteristic, but not to balance all three. Efficiency, barely passing here with a C. Again, highly reliant on shock technology and completely dependent on pivot placement, single pivot bikes can exhibit the greatest levels of pedaling feedback, depending on which chainring the rider is in. Independence, an interesting result of A+. This single pivot design can be tuned to win only one of these three critical suspension characteristics. Extremely heavy stock shock damping is added to the Rush's rear shock to make it not compress under braking, but making it perform poorly in the activity and efficiency categories. The R1i design, as found on Trek's Fuel EX. Activity, not bad. Gets a B-. Bump compliance is reasonable. Efficiency, again, not bad. Gets a straight A here. Pedals well with only minimal pedaling feedback in certain gear selections. Independence, a straight B. Because the rear pivot is centered around the rear axle, the R1i design functions much better than its earlier Trek predecessors, but still doesn't surpass the total independence of a dual-link design. Finally, there's Maestro, as found on Giant's Trance X. Activity, it gets an A+. From rapid-fire stutters to heavy G-out compression type hits, this type of suspension performs extremely well over most types of terrain. Efficiency, an A here. Almost zero shock compression can be felt when in all three front chainring combinations. Independence, a solid B here. It's almost impossible to achieve straight A's in every category, and Maestro sacrifices only a tiny amount of braking independence for outstanding activity and efficiency, a worthy engineering feat. So these are the grades of the suspension report card. While some suspension systems may rate higher in one particular category, it's important to note that only Maestro scores the highest overall grade. If we all rode mountain bikes over the identical type of terrain, a one-dimensional design might work. But because we ride up, down, and over an endless variety of routes, rocks, and dirt, we all demand a mountain bike design that works in all conditions. Perfectly balanced Maestro-equipped bicycles, such as the Anthem X Advanced SL, Trance X Advanced SL, Rain X, Faith, and Glory, provide just the right amount of activity, efficiency, and independence that off-road riders crave. Hopefully, in watching this presentation, you've learned a lot about Maestro suspension technology. Specifically, you've learned about the 4-2-1 concept and how it affects activity, efficiency, and independence. Beyond that, we also invite you to get out on a test ride on one of our bikes, because there's no better way to see if suspension works than on your own trails and under your specific conditions. Based on that test ride, and based on what you've learned today, we hope you agree that Maestro suspension technology is simply the best in the world.